Students, welcome you all in Rishikul Vidyapit online classes. This is module 2 and in this module we shall discuss about the story of the chapter The Address. Let's have the gist of the story in the next slide. So let's move and see. Students, in this slide we are discussing about the story of the chapter. This chapter is based on the Second World War, and in this chapter, the writer is describing about the consequences of the war. Let's come to know what happened during the war. The German invasion of Holland began in 1940. Holland expected to remain neutral as it had done during the First World War. However, the occupation was swift and after fierce fighting, Holland was forced to surrender. The Dutch Jews suffered persecution. The Jewish population in Holland in 1940 was about 1,40,000, of whom 20,000 were refugees. Amsterdam had the largest Jewish community of 90,000. Most were poor and did semi or unskilled work. Between 1940 and 1941, Jews were removed from public life and their land was sold to non Jews. The first mass arrest of Jews began in 1941. Their areas were raided and on 22 Feb 400 of them were taken away, never to return. In June, another 230 Jews, mainly refugees, suddenly disappeared. Nazi troops were called in to restore order. From July 1942, unemployed Jewish men were deported and sent to Nazi concentration camps. Soon, whole families were summoned, and this was when some of them went into hiding. Life for Dutch people was becoming harder. Families were left without fathers and sons. Everything became scarce, even ordinary household goods like soap and fuel. By the middle of 1944, there was a complete breakdown of services in Holland. There was no transport, no electricity, and no telephone services. Disease became widespread, thus increasing the death rate. The war and occupation caused the deaths of 240,000 Dutch people, 106,000 of whom were Jews. The act of genocide against the Jews were classified by the Allies war crimes trial as crimes against humanity. Thus, we can say that the consequences of war were unbearable. In the next slide, we shall come to know about the story and the themes of the chapter. So, let's move and see the next slide. Students, in this slide, we shall have the gist of the story. The Address is a short story highlighting human predicament that follows war. The story beautifully delineates the pain, anguish, and mental torture of the survivors of the war. The narrator Marga Minko, a Jew, returned back to her native city after the war was over. She had already suffered many losses, including the irreversible loss of her mother. After the war, she faced the loneliness and challenges alone. She went to Mrs. Dorling to get her mother's cutlery, crockery, utensils, and other household things. Mrs. Dorling Mrs. Dorling's cold, indifferent, and discouraging behavior further depressed her. She refused to recognize her and asked her to come again. She went back, and fortunately, Mrs. Dorling was not at home. Her daughter, who was 15-year old, received her and asked her to come inside the house. Sitting inside Mrs. Dorling's house, she suddenly made her mind to forget the things belonging to her mother. She thought her mother's things had no significance for her as the mother had died during the war. Finally, she decided to leave her mother's things and forget them. forever. After reading the story, we can say that this chapter teaches us that we should have such an approach to life that requires a large, generous heart, forgiveness, and an ability to overcome greed. It also requires a certain amount of let go attitude, a sense of resignation and reconciliation, the ability to take everything in one stride, a strong urge to move on in life. In the end, we can say that we must have positive attitude towards life because an optimistic person can survive in all the adverse conditions. Always be positive and try to do your best to overcome the unwanted situations. This is from my side. This is the module second and rest of the chapter will be discussed in the module third. Thank you. Have a nice day.